Today's scripture passage comes to us from Ezekiel, chapter 37, verses 1 through 14. Ezekiel writes, "The Lord took hold of me, and I was carried away by the Spirit of the Lord to a valley filled with bones. He led me all around among the bones that covered the valley floor. They were scattered everywhere across the ground and were completely dried out. Then he asked me, 'Son of man, can these bones become living people again?' 'O sovereign Lord,' I replied, 'you alone know the answer to that.' Then he said to me, 'Speak a prophetic message to these bones and say, "Dry bones, listen to the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am going to put breath into you and make you live again. I will put flesh and muscles on you and cover you with skin. I will put breath into you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord.' So I spoke this message just as he told me. Suddenly, as I spoke, there was a rattling noise all across the valley. The bones of each body came together and attached themselves as complete skeletons. Then, as I watched, muscle and flesh formed over the bones. Then skin formed to cover their bodies, but they still had no breath in them. Then he said to me, 'Speak a prophetic message to the winds, son of man. Speak a prophetic message and say, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, O breath from the four winds. Breathe into these dead bodies so they may live again." So I spoke the message as he commanded me, and breath came into their bodies. They all came to life and stood up on their feet, a great army. Then he said to me, "Son of man, these bones represent the people of Israel. They are saying, 'We have become old, dry bones. All hope is gone. Our nation is finished.' Therefore prophesy to them and say, 'This is what the sovereign Lord says. O my people, I will open your graves of exile and cause you to rise again. Then I will bring you back to the land of Israel. When this happens, O my people, you will know that I am the Lord. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live again, and return home to your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done what I said. Yes, the Lord has spoken.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Hello! I'm so happy you're here. I have two stories that I want to share with you today. The first is from the Bible. This is a story of a great prophet who lived thousands of years ago. His name was Ezekiel. Some of the stories about Ezekiel are very strange, almost like today's science fiction stories. Today's story might be a little scary, except that it has a really good ending. We have to first picture a very strange scene, and it might help us if we think of the movie The Lion King. Think of the scary scene where Simba, the young lion, is lost in a scary place. He finds himself surrounded by lots of animal bones. Now, instead of Simba walking around among all these bones, picture a man from the Bible. That's our prophet. In the Bible, Ezekiel finds himself in a desert valley surrounded by dry bones. How did he get there? Well, he didn't just get up one morning and think, "I know, I'll go looking for a place that is full of bones." No, according to the Bible, Ezekiel is sort of teleported into this barren valley full of bones. He just finds himself there. He must feel lonely and scared. And it is just he and the bones. Oh, but we can't forget, God is there too. God asks Ezekiel a question. He says, "Ezekiel, can these old dry bones live?" Ezekiel doesn't know how to answer this question. After all, he's talking to God. So Ezekiel answers very cleverly, "God, you know the answer." He's right. God does know the answer, and God tells Ezekiel that he will make these old dry bones live again. He will add muscle and skin to them and breathe life into them, and what appears to be dead will walk the earth again. Remember, I had two stories that I wanted to share with you today. The second one is one that I think most of you already know. It's not from the Bible, but it's still a good one. So Pinocchio was a puppet. He was nothing but a few sticks of dry wood screwed together. He was like the pile of dry bones, but after a long series of adventures which bring him closer to his father, the puppet maker, life is breathed into this puppet and he becomes a real boy. As a real boy, he can love his father and serve his father like he couldn't do when he was a puppet. Friends, God calls us and gives us new life to serve and love the Lord. Breathe in deep the hope that is in the breath of God. Amen.
Pastor John Ortberg tells the following story. He says, a friend of mine used to work as a denominational official in Minnesota. One of his jobs was to travel to little rural communities where they didn't have churches to do funerals. He would go out with an undertaker and they would drive together in the undertaker's hearse. One time they were on their way back from a funeral and my friend John was feeling quite tired, so he decided he would take a nap. Since they were in a hearse, he thought, well, I'll just lie down in the back of the hearse. Sounds like a kind of creepy thing to do, but this is a true story. The guy who was driving the hearse pulled into a service station because he was running low on gas. The service station attendant was filling up the tank and he was kind of freaked out because there was a body stretched out in the back. While he was filling the tank, John woke up, opened his eyes, knocked on the window, and then waved at the attendant. John said he never saw anybody run so fast in his entire life. For most people, when something they thought was dead comes back to life, it kind of freaks them out. Not so with Ezekiel. He watched as God breathed new life into a pile of dried up old bones. And then God told him he could do the same with the people of Israel who felt like those old bones, bereft of hope and joy. But this is a very relevant passage for us today because the coronavirus has had a dry bones effect on all of us. It threatens to steal our hope and joy from us. But the scriptures attest that God delights in taking things we thought were dead and breathing new life into them. That's what I want to focus on today. A little background on Ezekiel will be helpful in understanding this passage. Ezekiel is the prophet to the exiles. When Babylonia conquered Israel and exiled its leadership, Ezekiel was among the first wave of people to be taken away. He had begun his prophetic career in the land of Israel, and he continued it while living in Babylon. He prophesied about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which took place in 587 BC. The people's faith had never been so low. It's been shaken to its core. They had assumed that they were God's chosen people and that God would never allow them to be defeated or taken into captivity. And yet that's exactly what happened. So Ezekiel is ministering to a people who have lost all hope. Their land had been conquered. Their temple, God's house, had been destroyed. It is into this situation that Ezekiel shares a vision he had with his people. It is a vision of ultimate hope. He shares an experience he had in which God took hold of him and carried him away to a valley filled with dry bones. These bones were very old and scattered about. And God asked Ezekiel a ridiculous question. Son of man, can these bones become living people again? Well, most of us would have said no, absolutely not. They are scattered across the valley and are completely dried out. But Ezekiel's smarter than us. And he answers this question by saying, oh God, only you know the answer to that question. Bit of a cop-out, perhaps. And then God tells Ezekiel, speak a prophetic message to these bones and say, dry bones, listen to the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am going to put breath into you and make you live again. I will put flesh and muscle on you and cover you with skin. I will put breath into you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. When Ezekiel speaks, he hears a great rattling noise and the bones start to come together. Can you imagine that? Bones reattaching themselves to one another until full skeletons are formed. And then these same skeletons are covered with muscle and then with skin. It sounds like a scene from one of the mummy movies. But after all of this, do you know what Ezekiel had? Now he has a bunch of corpses because there was no breath in them. And so God tells Ezekiel to speak a prophetic message to the winds and to tell the winds to enter the body so that they might become alive again. And Ezekiel does. And when the winds enter the body, they become alive again, and they all stood up on their feet, a great army. And God tells Ezekiel that many of his people have been saying that they are like dry bones. All hope is gone. But through this vision, God shows Ezekiel that he can reanimate even dried out bones and breathe new life into things that we thought were dead. God promises to put his spirit within the people and restore the people to their homeland. It is a message of audacious hope. God is still in the business of reanimating dry bones. In fact, God delights in breathing new life into things we thought were dead, things we thought were beyond hope. God delights in breathing new life into things that we thought were dead, that we thought were beyond hope. Case in point, the resurrection of first Lazarus and then later Jesus. Those were certainly dry bone moments for their family and friends. That is, until God raised them. But in order to experience this rebirth, the newness of life that God offers, we have to take whatever may be drying out our bones and give it over to the Lord. In order to experience this rebirth, the newness of life that God offers, we have to take whatever may be drying out our bones and give it over to the Lord. Now, lest you think this too simplistic, it is actually harder than it sounds, because this will require a change from us. It will require a change in us. And we're not always eager to change, even if it means the difference between life and death. A 2006 medical study reveals just how difficult change is for people. Roughly 600,000 people have open heart surgery every year in America. These people are told after their surgeries that they must change. They must change their lifestyle. The heart bypass is a temporary fix. They must change their diet. They must quit smoking and drinking. They must exercise more and reduce the amount of stress in their lives. In essence, the doctors say, change or die. Now, you would think that a near-death experience would forever grab the attention of the patients. You would think that they would vote for change. You would think that the argument for change is so compelling that the patients would make the appropriate lifestyle alterations. Well, you would be wrong. Sadly, that is not the case. 90% of bypass patients do not change. They remain the same. They don't change their pre-surgery lifestyles. They continue to smoke and drink and eat fatty foods and not to exercise. 90%. Study after study indicates that 2 years after heart surgery, the patients have not altered their behavior. Instead of making changes for life, they choose death. Change is that difficult. It's sometimes harder to change than it is to live with the dried out bones we've become accustomed to. People who have overcome addictions can speak to this. But God can only breathe new life into those dry bone areas of our lives if we are willing to turn those things over to Him. Now, normally there are a variety of situations and challenges that can dry out our bones, and they are different for each and every one of us. But currently, we are all living through a bone-drying experience as we try to persevere through this pandemic. We have a common enemy, so to speak, in this virus. Rarely has something affected the entire planet like the coronavirus has. The one exception to this might be climate change. But climate change is affecting us slowly, almost imperceptibly, whereas the coronavirus changed our lives overnight. No place has been left untouched. Well, with the exception of Antarctica. It's the only continent that hasn't recorded a single case of COVID-19. Could be due to their isolation. But the rest of us are all struggling to make our way through this pandemic while trying to keep our sanity. And to be sure, some people have had to deal with a lot more issues that are byproducts of this pandemic and the stay home, stay safe order than other people have. For example, 1 in 5 families in America are currently experiencing food insecurity. Lines at the food banks are longer than ever before, rivaling what the country witnessed during the Great Depression. The unemployment rate has risen much faster than the stimulus checks and the unemployment benefits have gone out. And so too many people are struggling to pay their rent or to pay their house payment, as well as to meet other basic needs. And way too many people are grieving the loss of loved ones. COVID-19 was the third leading cause of death in the United States in April, behind only heart disease and cancer. Over 82,000 deaths have been due to COVID-19 in the US alone. And globally, it has caused over 290,000 deaths. And the death toll continues to climb daily, which is why we can't end the stay home, stay safe order too soon, or else we'll see a spike in cases and deaths. So as hard as it is for us, we must remain committed to the safety of our communities. We are living through an historic era. 10 years from now, children will be reading about the great COVID-19 pandemic in their history books. This pandemic, along with the social isolation it has forced upon us, can dry up our bones if we let it. So how do we avoid the dry bone syndrome that is threatening to overtake us? The simplest answer is often the best: prayer. The simplest answer is often the best: prayer. To remain spiritually strong during this pandemic, we need to admit our need for God. We need to admit our dependence on God. We need to acknowledge God's sovereignty in the midst of these trying times. Remind yourself that God is in control. Remember the promises of Scripture that say that God will bring something good out of this, even out of this pandemic. You know, when you pray, you can be brutally honest with God. It's all right to complain to God. It's even all right to yell at God. God can take it. It's all right to share your frustrations and your fears with God. It's all right not to feel okay during this difficult season. One of the byproducts of a loss of hope is a rise in suicides. Mental health experts have been trying to warn the country about the widespread mental health trauma that is affecting so many as a result of the coronavirus. They are worried that just as our hospitals weren't prepared for the onslaught of COVID-19 patients, so our mental health system will be unprepared and overwhelmed as well. One of the byproducts of this dry bones period we are living through is an assault on our mental health. Prayer is one of the tools we have to help cope with what's going on. If we are open and honest with God in our prayers, we can find solace and comfort and a renewed hope through Christ. Secondly, we can avoid the dry bones syndrome that is threatening to overtake us by reaching out to others. We can avoid the dry bones syndrome that is threatening to overtake us by reaching out to others. Famed psychologist Dr. Carl Menninger was once asked what one should do if they are feeling depressed or on the verge of a nervous or mental breakdown. And his answer: lock up your house, go across the railroad tracks and find someone in need and do something for them. Now, I know it's easier said than done during this stay home, stay safe order, but the principle remains true. I have read the story of Ezekiel more times than I can remember. You know, it's one of my favorite Old Testament stories. But one thing stood out to me when I read it this time that I hadn't really taken notice of before. And that is that God doesn't do this reanimation project alone. God doesn't do this reanimation project alone. God works through Ezekiel, who speaks prophetic words to those dry bones. Through God's partnership with Ezekiel, the dry bones come together and are given new life. And it occurred to me that God still works through us to help others reanimate the dry bone areas of their lives. God still works through us to help others reanimate the dry bone areas of their life. And so perhaps you have a friend who is struggling with depression because of this pandemic. You can be the one who speaks words of encouragement to them. You can be the one who calls them up and listens to their concerns. You know, just listening as our friends and family talk to us about their struggles is life-giving to them. Or perhaps you have friends who are struggling to keep their marriage together through this pandemic. A wave of divorce filings is expected to break across the country when COVID-19 confinement ends, according to several divorce lawyers. Being forced into such close proximity with one's spouse for longer periods of time, than couples are used to has exacerbated previous problems and fractured some relationships. If you have a friend or family member who is struggling with their marriage or with a relationship, you can be the one that God uses to help reanimate that dry bones area of their lives. Or if you know of someone who is struggling financially, you could extend a helping hand to them. Perhaps you received a stimulus check even though you don't need one. There are many worthy causes and needy people in our society these days. I know Missy and I are planning on using a large portion of our stimulus checks to help people who are experiencing food insecurity, as well as other pressing needs. And just as God worked through Ezekiel to breathe new life into some dried up old bones, so God can use us in this season of fear and uncertainty to breathe new life into others. So if you get a nudge to call someone, don't ignore it. God works through us to help breathe new life into others' old, dried out bones. Our God is the source of our unquenchable hope. So even in the midst of difficult times, when it seems that the life is just being sucked right out of us and our bones are drying out, our God can breathe new life into us. Whatever it is that is drying out our bones, we need to give it over to God and take it to God in prayer and ask God to breathe new life into us. And then look for opportunities where God can work through you for the sake of others. God is in the business of reanimating dried out bones. So don't be surprised when God breathes new life into something that you thought was dead. Stay safe and well. And thanks for listening.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved